If anxiety feels like something you're constantly managing instead of being freed from, it's because you're missing the most important piece of the puzzle. So, fear, especially anxiety, is nothing more than the consequence of an ignored conscience. Now, I know that sounds a little bit confusing, and if you're anything like me, it intuitively feels wrong. But that's exactly why it's such an important insight. People think fear equates to weakness, and until recently, I did too. But I've come to realize that this is incorrect. Fear is information. It's the mind responding to a perceived threat. If someone's actively trying to hurt you, you should be a little bit afraid so that you're motivated to take appropriate action. Anxiety is something else. Anxiety is what happens when information is missing. When the mind can't identify the cause of pressure, it turns to imagination and starts predicting every possible outcome. That process obviously has no natural limit. And because fear is processed through the same systems that govern bodily sensation, those imagined outcomes don't stay abstract. They feel physical, urgent, and real. And the body reacts as if the threat is real and already exists. That's why panic attacks have the physical effects that they do. And this is how we end up torturing ourselves. As the saying goes, we suffer more in imagination than in reality. Fear itself isn't the problem. Unbounded fear is. Because fear is useful when it prepares us for danger, but it's destructive when it has no clear object. That's why reassurance doesn't calm anxiety, clarity does. The mind doesn't need comfort, it needs causes. Causes can be faced. Causes restore proportion. When the mind can't find them, it invents them. But you've heard all this from me before. What I've never thought to ask, though, is why are we so often in this state to begin with? And the answer is that on some level, we already know how we ought to act. Work diligently, face what we're avoiding, be honest, stop procrastinating, and yet we ignore the inner signal. We cut corners, blur lines, and justify choices we know don't hold up under the pressures of reality. Even if we lie to ourselves, unconsciously, we know that we're lying. And once that happens, this is the insight, guys, our own reasoning stops supporting us and starts fighting us. The inner guidance, our conscience that should orient us towards the best possible course of action, instead becomes our enemy. The mind becomes divided, and that fracturing is where anxiety begins to fester. So the real reason you feel like you're constantly managing the effects of anxiety, but never pulling it up by the roots, is that you're looking for comfort instead of dealing with the issue your mind is actually reacting to. If a thorn gets stuck in your foot, no amount of topical treatment or numbing will fix the problem until you dig the splinter out. That process is painful, but the relief and healing are immediate. So how do we dig out the thorn? Well, first, stop asking how to feel better and start asking what you're avoiding. Anxiety isn't your freaking inner child learning how to self-soothe. You're an adult. It's time to grow up and stop sucking on your thumb, or your vape, or your shotgun, whatever it is. Hiding under the blankets doesn't protect you from intruders, but that's exactly what we're doing psychologically when we seek comfort instead of confrontation. Anxiety isn't the brain asking for reassurance, it's pointing at something unfinished. More often than not, it's tied to a conversation you won't have, a responsibility you keep delaying, or a standard that you've compromised. Until that thing is faced, the anxiety has no reason to stop, because from the mind's perspective, the problem is still an active threat. Now, pause. I fully understand that this process of self-discovery can be extremely uncomfortable and painful. Don't think that I'm belittling the difficulty by any means. I'm simply speaking in extreme terms because you've spent your whole life coddled to the other extreme. So I need to shatter the paradigm in order to help you. And the first lesson is that true relief doesn't come from calming down. It comes from facing what you're avoiding. The next step is to translate anxiety into something specific. Anxiety is vague by nature, not because it's meaningless, but because it's pointing to something rather than speaking about it. Conscience, on the other hand, is precise. That's why the right question isn't, why am I anxious? But what do I already know that I should be doing? And what am I pretending to not see? For example, my ex made me feel bad for being anxious in our relationship, but it turns out that I had used her red flags as a blindfold so I wouldn't have to face the truth, which is that she did not love me. And because I've dealt with so many manipulative people, sometimes I still get anxious even when people aren't out to get me. I've got that PTSD, paranoid till she dies. But it's because anxiety still operates on an unresolved internal pattern. When my mind learned that vigilance kept me safe in manipulative environments, it kept that setting on even after the danger had passed. And it's taken time, intention, and better people to retrain how I think enough to start feeling calm again. But a lot of people get stuck there in that place. So that's worth a separate episode. But anyway, when anxiety feels general and everywhere, it's usually because the real issue is narrow but unaddressed, which is good news. Once you've translated anxiety into something specific, the next step is to name the cause without negotiating or making excuses. This is where people usually mess up, including myself, because the instinct is to justify, explain, or soften the truth with context and rationalizations that protect the ego. People sometimes criticize the harshness of my delivery and say, you can catch more flies with honey than vinegar. Oh yeah? And you can catch even more with bullshit, which is all this new age garbage has ever had to offer, a big, fat, steaming pile of it. Because that's what people want to hear. They don't want the complicated, difficult solution that's going to involve self-reflection. They want the easy answer. They want to hear something that makes them feel good, something that validates the lie that they've been telling themselves, and that's exactly how we end up trapped. We dress lies up as explanations. We confuse comfort for healing and use stories to cover wounds that actually need to be cleaned out, not sugar-coated. Fear shows up when we abandon the help that comes from reason because it's hard to listen to our conscience and do the right thing. So instead, we hope we're the exception, that consequences somehow won't apply to us, that we can stay ignorant of what's actually causing the torment. That's why anxiety is so hard to unravel. Not because it's complex, but because dealing with it means confronting the ego directly. It means giving up the fantasy, dropping the cover stories, and admitting where we've been avoiding responsibility or lowering moral standards. That applies to every time you skip a workout, shirk responsibility, lie, cheat, steal, etc. Ever notice how manipulative people are the most paranoid? How they have no mental rest? If you want real growth, this is the work that you have to do. It's not enough to repeat affirmations or manage symptoms. You have to stop protecting your ego and start telling the truth plainly enough that your mind can finally stand behind you again. That way, your sense of reason is in alignment with your actions. And guys, that's the breakthrough. When you act in accordance with reason, you're able to do something with the feedback you get, except ignore it because of the cognitive dissonance and the discomfort that it brings. You don't make excuses for why things don't go right anymore. You actually just start to process the data and learn. Because don't get me wrong, you'll still make mistakes. You'll still think you figured it out, only to realize in a few years that you were wrong. Again, it's a lifelong process, but that doesn't mean you won't make and be able to enjoy meaningful progress along the way. This is a difficult journey. The immediate goal isn't a grand reset or some dramatic transformation. Trust me, you probably don't want that actually, because it tends to be extremely painful. Sometimes it happens, but usually that's only after either a traumatic experience or once you've spent years chipping away at something and the smaller issues just start to come apart until you're able to dislodge something bigger. And often it's a combination of those two things. You don't need the full solution yet. You need one small action that restores integrity, one move that realigns your behavior with what you already know is right and you should be doing. So send the message, tell the truth, make the decision that you've been postponing, admit the mistake, do the work you've been avoiding. It's always scary to confront the darkness, but it makes me think about a story of a man who was on trial. Throughout the hearing, it becomes obvious that he's hiding something because he's afraid. But the judge is experienced and very perceptive. He realizes the man is being influenced by someone who has committed an even greater crime, but he won't admit his situation because it would require an admission of guilt. So he's stuck. But the judge tells the man, listen, I can protect you from this other person if I know what's going on. And likewise, it's really hard for us to admit to the ugly parts of ourselves. But until we do, there's simply no amount of surface level work or medications that can fix the problem. The doctor can't help us either if we don't tell him what's wrong. Your conscience, your reasoning, your inner guide won't help when you try to control them and force truth that you know is a lie. It just doesn't work that way. But it's gonna be hard. Expect resistance. It's normal to stare into the abyss and feel like it's become a part of you in some way. That's not failure, it's part of the extraction process. When you move towards the thing you've been avoiding, anxiety tends to intensify right before it breaks because the thorn is finally being pulled, but the area around it is really sensitive. So the hardest part is usually the part right before the breakthrough. This isn't about perfection, it's about responsiveness. Conscience only becomes loud when it's being ignored. When you respond early and consistently and stop violating it, it doesn't need to escalate just to get your attention. So, guys, thank you so much for listening. I wish you the best. Also, shout out to everybody that's been reaching out to encourage and support me over the time that I've kind of been away. I've had a lot going on, and a lot of you guys have been awesome for just being super supportive and giving me a reason to keep doing this. And that really means the world to me. And at the end of the day, you guys are the reason that I'm still in business, that I'm still doing what I'm doing. So I'm glad that I've had an impact on you. I hope you know that you've had one on me as well.